Right, should we start? Good. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to come and listen to me talk. I hope you find it interesting. Emily very kindly invited me here to talk about the work that I do in wildlife conservation in the Congo Basin. And we met 3 months ago during the Old Boys Cross Country, where as the captain of the cross country team, right, you managed to lead us halfway to Western and missed the turning to gym path, which I thought was quite... But despite that, I was very happy to come and talk to you and to everybody watching on the video later. I hope you guys find this interesting. I'm an old boy myself. I'm actually coming back from my 20-year reunion on Sunday. And what you suggested that I might want to talk about is just talk about the work that I do out in out in Congo in wildlife conservation, and then also I think there was some interest is from kind of from a careers point of view. If you were interested in getting involved in this sector, kind of where might you go, what might you do, and then if there's time, and I know that some of you here are on the Green Committee, kind of a discussion about how some of what's happening on a global scale might be applicable here at the kind of level of the school. I think I'll leave those last two topics for a kind of more general discussion between us, and I'll spend kind of 25 minutes, 30 minutes just doing a little presentation and showing you what it is we do. So all good presentations have to start with a map. And so this is the part of the world that we're talking about. We would call it, I suppose, Central Africa as a region. And I'd say it's actually probably one of the parts of the planet which is kind of less well known. We don't hear about it that much in our news. The history and culture and biodiversity of this area is not particularly well known. The Congo Basin is probably also the most kind of commonly referred to geographic structure which we talk about. And the Congo River, of course, is the second largest river in the world, both by length and by volume. And the basin itself is obviously the drainage area which feeds into the river. And that dominates the geography of this part of the world and creates the high rainfall, and other factors create this area surrounded in yellow here is the Congo Basin rainforest. Second largest forest in the world, behind the Amazon, kind of the second lung of the planet. It's huge. I mean, people say it's the size of Western Europe, which I always find is not a particularly helpful, because I don't really know how big Western Europe is. But just think Spain, France, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Britain, add them all together. Another way to think of it is it's the size of India within that space. Unlike India, with 1 billion people, there's a tenth of the number of people here, so there's 100 million people. So it's actually one of the lowest density of human populations anywhere on the planet. And those people are living in, by most measures, they're the poorest people on the planet. The average life expectancy in that yellow line is 55 years old. Average household size is 7 people. Average number of kids that a woman would have would be between 5 and 7, half of which would die before their first birthday. So it's a very poor, very challenged part of the world, and correspondingly, the levels of governance, we might say, and governance is a word we're going to kind of keep coming back to in this talk, are correspondingly low. It's very lawless in parts. There's a lot of militia. There's a lot of war. I mean, befitting that its status is kind of a forgotten corner. The Congolese War of the kind of late 90s, some estimates put 5 million people having died. And I challenge you to find someone who knows about the kind of Congolese War of the 90s. So a huge amount of suffering and a huge amount of challenges in this part of the world. But incredible people and incredible biodiversity. So the big difference between the Congo rainforest and the Amazon rainforest is the large mammals which still exist in the Congo rainforest. So we have lowland gorillas, the kind of slightly less hairy cousin of the highland gorillas, which most people are kind of most familiar with. We've chimpanzees, bonobos. One of the great biologists amongst you, the great dividing lines in mammal geography is chimpanzees only exist north of the Congo River, bonobos only exist south of the Congo River, and that's 100% true throughout all of their home ranges. and forest elephants, which were recently described as their own separate subspecies. Their ivory is slightly thicker and slightly rose-colored, more dense than the savanna elephants, and so that makes it even more highly prized for ivory hunting because it makes even nicer ornaments. So that little red box, if you can see that on the display, is the area of Congo that I've been most active in. So I've been involved out there for 7 years, and I was living in that red box for 4 of them, and been involved in a few other national parks around the basin as well. And that may not come out, it does come out quite well on the screen. So that's a kind of close-in of that red box, and the green areas are the national parks. And so you can see that there's a network of national parks and protected areas across the 3 countries, Congo, Republic of Congo. Something I didn't know before I moved out there is that there are 2 countries called Congo, the Republic of Congo and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Any country which puts democratic in its name, you know that it's not. And I live in the even less democratic one. And so the brown areas are logging concessions. So they are managed by private companies and for timber. That's what it looks like from the air. And so it's these vast, unending vistas of just green cauliflowers, broccolis, rainforest. And one of the big challenges of working in the rainforest environment is that it's so dense that to give you a good picture of what it looks like in the understory is really quite challenging. There's plenty of parts of the forest where we wouldn't be able to see each other because the vegetation is so dense. So any kind of research work or law enforcement, anti-poaching operations in the forest are incredibly challenging just due to the ecosystem, the terrain. So I was thinking of like showing you a bunch of pictures as to what it looks like in the rainforest, but there's this kind of neat video that we made a couple of years ago to celebrate the 25th anniversary of that national park that was in the middle of the previous slide, Nabali Ndoki National Park, which has been the park that I've been most involved with in my time out there. Nabali Ndoki itself, it's the single largest area of rainforest in the Congo Basin that has never been logged, has no roads, and has no human habitation within its boundaries. And including the other national parks which form this kind of complex, transboundary complex of national parks, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it's 2 million hectares. That's twice the size of Greater London, so imagine the M25 and double it. And no people, no roads, never been logged. It is one of the kind of last true wildernesses left on our planet. And so the video we made was about the 25th anniversary of that park. And the organization I work for, which we'll talk about a bit later, the Wildlife Conservation Society, has been helping the government of Congo to manage that national park for the last, well, almost 30 years now. So I'm going to show you a short video. It's in French. Any French students? No? Okay, great. It's got English subtitles. And it's about 4 minutes long, and it will just give you a picture of what the park does and what it looks like kind of on the ground. So. There you go. I've watched that 100 times and it still gives me like tingles. So you got a bit of an overview as to what we do, and that was obviously produced by some Americans with the dramatic music, and it was intended for the audience of the government to impress upon them what a great job we're doing in running the foundation. But it gave you kind of a bit of an overview of the work that we do with the communities, the work that we're obviously doing in terms of law enforcement and anti-poaching. And with the rest of the talk, I just want to drill down or put the spotlight onto kind of four themes which I think are kind of interesting, and hopefully maybe, I think one of the kind of working titles of the talk was kind of new solutions to old problems. And we're not reinventing the wheel here, we're doing basic things well, but maybe just some angles and looking at things which in a way which maybe hasn't been looked at before. And so that'll be intelligent law enforcement, not just about the anti-poaching fight, but more about making that more effective and more intelligent. Evidence-based solutions, which is something which runs throughout our approach. The really important role of communities in conservation. And then something which looks a bit mysterious at the moment, but will become clear, is the kind of role of a national park as an anchor institution in a part of the world where governance is not as strong. So, what does it mean to kind of enforce the law in these national parks? Well, the thing to start talking about would be the level of threat that we face. Why do we need to enforce the law? Why do we need to protect these ecosystems? Well, 30 years ago, these national parks were just vast open areas where there were no forestry, there was very small numbers of indigenous people living there, so that area that I talked about, that 2 million hectares, that area that's twice the size of Greater London, 40 years ago, there would have been 2,000 people living in that space. And they would have been taking whatever they need from the forest, hunting, gathering timber products and so on. And it would have been completely sustainable because their level of offtake would have been such that the ecosystem would have just regenerated. What's happened in the 30 or 40 years since then is that the forestry companies have moved in. And look, when I moved out, I thought that the forestry companies were the bad guys, and they're not. There's a lot of forestry companies that are badly managed and they do their work unsustainably. There are plenty that do their work really responsibly. The forestry companies that operate around that national park, the Nubali and Doki that we've been talking about, they're all FSC certified, which is the Forestry Stewardship Council. They take 1 tree per hectare, which is not very much. And they have all sorts of programs to reinvest in local communities and try and minimize the impact of what they're doing. But however hard they try, what an inevitable consequence of creating economic activity in an area which is relatively isolated is that you bring more people into that area. You need people to work the chainsaws and drive the trucks and feed the staff, and then their families come, and then communities start. So today, instead of 2,000 people, we have 25,000 people living in the park. Sorry, around the park. Within the park, there's still no human habitation. So you've had an order of magnitude change in how many people live immediately outside the park, within 30 to 50 kilometers, that kind of distance. And the demands that places on the ecosystem, well, you guys can do the math, right? It's an order of magnitude higher. And then you add to that the increase in transportation, which has changed in the last 30 years as well. It used to take 2 weeks to get to Nubali and Doki from Brazzaville, the capital. Today you can do it in 15 hours on a pretty good road. And so it's not just the 25,000 people that are living around the national park which are using the resources. Those resources can be harvested and shipped to Brazzaville, from where they can be shipped to Paris and onwards. So you have a global market placing pressures on what was once a pristine, isolated part of the world. And that story is replicated the world over with national parks. So the 2 main threats that we face are what we call unsustainable bushmeat hunting, or bushmeat demand. So that's antelopes and monkeys and small animals, sometimes big animals, which people predominantly use for meat. And then ivory poaching elephants for ivory for international markets, typically in Asia. So those are the 2 big threats that we face. Now, what does law enforcement look like in that environment where I can't see you if you're 5 meters away? Well, it's really challenging. Now, we would conduct the traditional ranger patrols, which would be perhaps familiar to you from kind of Southern African or Eastern African examples. A unit of guys goes out. They're typically armed because the poachers are armed. We're talking about, dangerous people here. And they try and track them down, they try and encounter them, and then they arrest them. Problem is that's quite difficult in the rainforest because you could walk straight past somebody and you wouldn't even know that they were there. So what we've had to do is, we do a lot of this kind of stuff where we put up roadblocks and we check logging trucks, make sure people aren't smuggling goods out and try and intercept it on its way out of the forest. But we've had to take a more kind of intelligence-based approach. Now, that's not going to come out too well, but I'll explain it. All of our guys, all of our units are equipped with GPS, real-time communication devices. So through the investment in kind of communications technology, we can now see exactly where our rangers are at any given time. We can also communicate with them. So I've just highlighted it so you can kind of see it a bit easier. So we can see exactly where they go, and then we can actually communicate with them and we can say, well, this is where you need to go next. Because 15 years ago, they would have had a set route. They would have walked in the forest for 2 weeks. They would have come back. They might have encountered a poacher. They might not. We would have tried for them to walk on a well-worn path, but maybe they would encounter them, maybe they don't. So with the ability to communicate with them real time, we can use other sources of information to inform the patrol so that they go to the places where we know people are going to be. And so we use what you could call policing methods or criminology, and we work with the local police in northern Congo, and we have networks of informants in the criminal gangs that operate the poaching who give us information about where the next strike is going to be. And then we can communicate in real time to our ranger units and say, change the course. We know that there's a potential raid happening in this part of the forest. The other cool thing you can do with the information that you get from these networks is when you make an arrest, let's say one of our patrols arrests somebody, they might arrest them in the forest, they might arrest them in a village, we can then seize their mobile phone. The police do this, of course, it's all done under kind of proper norms of policing. You then download the data from their phone, and once you've arrested 3 or 4 different guys, you start to realize that they've all got that same guy's number in their phone. Well, now that might be a coincidence, they might just all be mates with the same person. But you build up a big enough network and you start to understand who the kingpins are in the criminal networks that are operating. And with some clever policing software, you start to be able to plan out these maps. So you start to understand not the guy on the ground with the gun, but the network which is operating above them. And that often, this is an example from Tanzania, anonymized obviously, and I didn't want to talk about Congo, but this includes corrupt customs agents who are turning a blind eye when the ivory makes it down to, in this case, Dar es Salaam, and then over to China. So by using what are basic methods in our cultures, but are new approaches to wildlife conservation, we're becoming much more effective at enforcing the law in a kind of an intelligent way. So that is one of the roads in northern Congo, which is very good, built by the Chinese to get resources from a resource-rich area to a port, as most good roads are in many parts of Africa. And that is a truck full of bushmeat, which is the other big problem. And one of the consequences of, and this is kind of on this theme of kind of an evidence-based approach, one of the consequences of these transport networks being able to get animals out of the forest so quickly is that I'll come to that in a second. I've been in Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport, having got off the plane from Brazzaville, and I'm stood at the luggage carousel, and I can smell the bushmeat in the luggage going round the carousel, because you get attuned to what that smells like. It's not very pleasant. So we know that animals get shot in the forests in northern Congo. They get to Brazzaville, and then within 24 hours they can be in a restaurant on a dinner plate in Paris, because there's a big diaspora and they want to eat bushmeat. It's actually seen as a delicacy in many respects. It's seen a bit like organic food is seen to us. It's like eat healthy, eat bushmeat. It's that's the mentality. Now, that's a problem for the the levels of the sustainability of the forest. The forest, could become emptied if that continued. But it also has a implication for disease transmission, because what's to stop a bat which has COVID 2022 being shot in northern Congo and being eaten by a guy in Paris within that 24-hour time frame? And you realize how quickly these things can spread. So one of the parts of what we do is, and this isn't going to tell you a huge amount of information, but it's just illustrative, is we have a network of villages, all of the villages, who we engage with the hunters in those communities. And we say, look, this is a big area, this is about the size of Switzerland, we can't police this and stop you, but maybe we can manage the fallout. And we say, if you find a dead animal in the forest, not one that you've shot, because we've got things that we can try and do to stop that, but if you find a dead animal, give us a call and don't touch it. And then we dispatch a team of veterinarians to sample that carcass, and then we test it for anthrax, Ebola, monkeypox currently, anything we like. And that's kind of an early warning system to the potential spread of future outbreaks. So wildlife conservation is kind of quite a wide, enforcing the law with patrols and so on is one part of it, but it all comes kind of down to, a lot of our approach comes down to that's this saying on the screen there, you can't protect what you don't understand. And that's, I would say, probably one of the foundational kind of pillars of our organization and the way that we operate. So whether it's trying to understand disease ecology, whether it's trying to understand criminal networks, whether it's habituating lowland gorillas so that we can study their behavior and in ecology, or maybe we can take tourists to them in the future and generate revenue for the national park. You can only do that if you understand what you're trying to protect. Evidence-based solutions. So now everything I've just said, that you're probably worried about this guy getting anthrax, and you probably might think he's a bad guy because he's got a animal on his back and he's obviously shot that duiker. When I first moved out there, I would definitely admit to going out there and being like, yeah, the poachers are the bad guys. And very quickly you realize that guy's just feeding his family, right? He's not a bad guy. He's just doing what any of us would do in his situation. So using that evidence-based approach, can we understand why he's doing what he's doing? And maybe if we can understand why he's doing what he's doing, we can tailor our interventions such that maybe we can provide an alternative. So this data I'm going to show you is from 2017. So it's a little bit old, but it serves the purposes quite nicely. And on the y-axis, you've got the number of elephants that were poached, and on the x-axis, you've got the months of the year. And you can see that if we look at the first 6 months of the year, 3 elephants were poached in January, 4 elephants were poached in February, 3 in March, 2 in April, 1 in May. And we're discovering that those poachers through our ranger patrols that are walking through the forests. So there's not really much of a pattern here. It's declining slightly, but the numbers are quite low. And maybe if we were to, think, okay, well, maybe the rest of the year would look the same. There might be some things that would affect it, but it would be potentially a reasonable assumption to think that it would be at a fairly constant level. The seasons are pretty standard. It's a tropical rainforest where there's no winter and no summer per se. So if we look at the next 6 months, July and August are double what January and February were, and then 50% again in November and December. So time for me to ask you all a question. Why, and this is a trend that we see year on year, why do you think there are big spikes in July and August and November and December? There are no bad ideas. Go on.
November and December, possibly for Chinese New Year, coming up after that as a greater demand for ivory products.
That's a really good answer. That's a really good answer. Yeah.
I don't know about July and August.
No, that is a very good answer. It's not the conclusion we came to, but it could very well be part of the problem.
Is there any major competitions going around there where they want the elephants to be poached, or prize stuff?
Yeah, that's a really good idea as well. There aren't, so that's not why that trend's happening. And your idea is a good one, but does it explain the July and August?
Is there more tourism, which means that it's easier to smuggle things through because there's just more traffic through the area?
Good thinking. I'm liking the way you're going. there was no tourism in 2017.
Okay.
It's like 0. So that's not it. Anyone else want to have a go?
House sweeping festivals in September tend to have a lot of ivory jewellery and stuff. So could that also explain July and August?
That is not a bad idea. There would be a lag though, wouldn't there? In terms of when the elephant's poached, it takes months for it to get to the Chinese market. So there would be a lag, but you're thinking along the right lines. And basically the answer is that it's not because of the elephant's behavior. It's not because they all go somewhere different at those times of year. So it's not biology or geography or weather. It's basically economics. It's kind of the lines that you guys were heading on. So what happens in December where people might need ivory? Why do people need ivory, I suppose, would be the first question. Well, they need ivory because, remember, we established that these people were really poor. Everybody's really poor. They're living hand to mouth. So if they need money at a given moment, they go to the forest and they take resources and they sell them. Or they go to a criminal gang and they get paid to go shoot an elephant. But fundamentally, the forest is the resource bank on which they draw when they need money. So why do people need money in December? And why do they need it in August?
Taxes.
It's really simple. It's really simple, and the answer is, and all your parents will know why you need money in August and September, because schools start. So in August, they need to pay the school fees for the year for their kids. So they need money, so they go hunting. December, it's Christmas. It's as simple as that. And we know that that's why they go in, because they want to throw a big party at Christmas and they want to buy gifts for their family, and it's as easy as that. So by understanding why we were seeing those trends, we were able to tailor our interventions to try and kind of disrupt those dynamics. So, well, what did we do? And you saw a bit of it in the video. We started providing scholarships for the students living in the villages around the park. So that couldn't provide it for every student, but it lowered the pressure. We started providing textbooks and educational supplies so that the schools directly, so that the parents didn't have to buy those for their kids, so that the pressure was less. We started providing pensions to the really elderly people, so that the pressure on the family to respect the elders, as it were, at that moment at Christmas would maybe be a little bit lower. We started doing community pharmacies to try and lower the pressure on families from kind of healthcare costs, supporting the health centres that exist. And so all of those kind of interventions, as well as a lot of law enforcement and a kind of holistic approach, we think has changed the situation. So now I would love to say that's the data for 2021, and we're not quite there yet, but we're making really big progress. So in the last 6 months, we found 1 elephant that's been poached in the park. Actually, it's a bit more than 6 months now. It'll be October, so it'll be 9 months. So we're hoping to go a full year without having any elephants poached, and it's halved from the year before that, which halved from the year before that, which halved from the year before that. So it's something's going right, and I'd like to suggest that it's because you look at the evidence, you understand motivations, and then you can kind of tailor solutions. So to come to kind of the final point of what I wanted to talk about was this idea of an anchor institution. And we've talked about how Congo is a really challenging place. There's lots of problems. The governments don't function very well. Civil society organizations don't function very well. There isn't really the same kind of rule of law and processes that we're all so used to in these countries that kind of make life predictable and normal and means that we can all be, the pursuit of life, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and all of that good stuff. So it doesn't really exist. But we're still trying to achieve our objective, but we need to do that with everybody involved, with the whole community, with all of the people that live there. And so if we can create this kind of sense of the park functions, and it's this beacon of good governance in this kind of sea of chaos. We can't change the whole country, but we can change what happens in those communities that live immediately around the park. Then not only are we're more able to implement what we want to do, it also improves the kind of standard of living for everybody around, and hopefully kind of reduces levels of conflict and all of those kind of other problems that we talked about. So this is kind of, I want to make 2 final points, and this is the penultimate one. And this is about human conflict, because that's a kind of common theme that we see a huge amount of in Congo. And I've always been interested in the relationship between human conflict and biodiversity loss. And you would think that is kind of quite predictable. Where you have human conflict, you would probably have more biodiversity loss because you've got a warlord who's not respecting the rule of law and they're just going to go in and take whatever they need from the forest and cut down the trees or, seize a mine and expand its operations or whatever they might be doing. But one of the really fascinating things is that actually it works the other way around as well. So where you have biodiversity loss, you have an increase in human conflict. And this map here is all of the biodiversity hotspots on the planet. Now, if you read into what the definition of a hotspot is, it's not just where you have lots of biodiversity. It's where biodiversity has declined steeply and they're experiencing significant loss. So that's what they look like, roughly, on a map. Bit of artistic license given. What happens if we were to overlay the human conflicts that have happened in the last 50 years? This data's a tiny bit old. It doesn't include Ukraine, sadly. There's almost an exact correlation between where biodiversity is being destroyed and where human conflicts have happened. To the extent which 90% of human conflicts that have happened in the last 50 years occur in countries where there's been major biodiversity loss. So why would that happen? Well, think about the Somalian pirates. That was, a huge problem about a decade ago. And it was as a result of the Somalian government being overthrown. The fishing laws were not enforced. International fishing companies came in and trawled the sea. The small-time fisherman on the coast with his little boat could no longer feed his family because the ecosystem had been destroyed and there was no fish left because the international fishing trawler had come in. So he's got no choice but to grab an AK-47 and go and make money some other way and feed his family some other how. That's kind of a really clear, understandable example of how, sure, it's an iterative process. It's a kind of negative spiral, or can often be. But it's an example of where an ecosystem collapsing caused human conflict. And that is particularly true in Eastern DRC, which is where I've been working in the safe bit of Congo. It's actually very safe there. It's remarkably calm. Eastern Congo is a completely different story. That's where the wars have been and where militia groups still cause real problems. And the collapse of ecosystems because of uncontrolled forestry, uncontrolled mining, is meaning people don't have a livelihood. And so then they join a militia, which then propagates the problem. So this is an argument, I think it's an argument for lots of things. I think it's an argument that we should take a lot of our trillions of dollars of defense spending and put it into conserving biodiverse areas. But it's an argument for good governance where we can. If we can make things work in the areas where we have the power to intervene, then we can actually shortcut this problem and solve the problem. And the final thing I just wanted to talk about, and this is maybe a cliche, so I apologize for ending on it, but it's the single most powerful reason why I think we need to act on this issue. There's so many issues, and I'm thinking back from 20 years when I was sat where you guys are sat, and how interestingly climate change, we were taught a lot about climate change, but biodiversity really wasn't something that was kind of featured in our syllabus, or certainly the loss of biodiversity. It just wasn't as well known. Since 1970, 60% of all biomass on the planet has disappeared. Of animals. It's just this incredible idea that 60% of all the animals on the planet have disappeared since 1970. And that's happened in, well, not quite our lifetimes, but it is happening in our lifetime. And it's this problem which I think is an old problem, which is why I think it's maybe a little bit artistic license, but this kind of idea of new solutions to old problems. The problem of biodiversity loss is an old problem. It's always been a challenge for us as a species whenever we come into contact with natural systems that we exploit them unsustainably. And the best example of that is Easter Island, which you guys might already know about. Easter Island's an island in the Southeast Pacific, and I'm going to take a bit more artistic license, but when Western discoverers came and discovered it in the 16th century, they found all of these stone heads and basically no people. And they were like, well, how did the stone heads get there? They had no idea. There must have clearly once been a civilization that lived on these islands, which put up these monuments to their ancestors or to whatever they were. But they couldn't work out how the people would have survived. because there was no wood on the island at all. There wasn't a single tree on the island. And of course, what had happened is that colonizers had arrived much before the Western colonizers, and they'd started living on Easter Island, and they'd started using the forest, and they'd started cutting down the forest because they were feeding their families and because they were, building their houses and doing everything that humans do all the time. And their populations grew, but the size of the island didn't grow, and they were using the resources unsustainably. And so then, and this always blows my mind, at some point, somebody cut down the last tree on that island. And what is the Earth if it's not Easter Island on a grand scale? And this is the best photo in human history, in my opinion, Earthrise. We are this tiny island in this sea of black, and we are doing exactly what happened on Easter Island all over again. Now, I'm immensely hopeful that it can change, because I've spent the last 7 years being very frustrated, but ultimately ending up being quite optimistic that things can change if we apply new solutions to these old problems. That's the end of my talk.